Hello, everyone. Today I am with Mary Antonia Wood, PhD, and Mary is the author of her new book, The Archetypal Artist, Reimagining Creativity and the Call to Create. Mary is chair and professor for the Depth Psychology and Creativity program at Pacifica Graduate Institute in the US. She's a visual artist, and she works in a variety of media, and she's the founder of Talisman Creative Media. So welcome, Mary.
Thank you, John. It's wonderful to be with you.
Mary, your book was very synchronistic to me. It came at a good time, and it's lovely when that happens because I've been thinking about some things, and then I started to read your book, and one thing I like about it is it's like you've done this scholarship, fine scholarship with that book, and then there's the mystery of you haven't reduced creativity, it seems to me. It's like, I think the first line is creativity is an enigma, but it's the mystery of the artist is there as well. So it's got both sides, and it's got some great stuff in it. So I was hoping that maybe we could talk about that today, and some of your story, and who influenced you, and how you came to write that book.
That would be my pleasure.
So fire away, Mary. Go for it.
Okay. Well, I think I came to write this over decades of pondering the questions that all creative people ponder. Why is it that I have these urges to make things? Why am I always longing for time to experiment, to waste in trying things out? Where will I find an audience for this? Will anyone care? And yet I persist, just as most creative people will, regardless of the odds against that it is not a sensible thing to be doing. I think we can be talked out of our creative callings, but as James Hillman pointed out in his notion of the daemon, our destinies can be postponed, but the daemon doesn't go away. So I think my story is not so unusual in that in midlife, that daimonic nudging or reminder came to be very much at the forefront of my life. So as a visual artist, as a former corporate person in a creative post in the corporate world at one time in my life, all of those lives seem to come to a kind of transition point at around the time I turned 50, where I needed to really find out for myself more about this creative calling, more about the agonies and the occasional ecstasies. Well, more than occasional, but the agonies are there of a creative life, the ups and downs, financially, emotionally, all across the board. So that drew me to the study of depth psychology. Entry point for me was Joseph Campbell and his work on comparative mythology. So much of that informed my own art making as I was drawn to the images, the stories, the myths, especially of Mesoamerica, which is part of my own heritage, my Mexican heritage. So with the forays into Campbell, that was the opening for me at that time when I really needed to go more deeply. I discovered Jung, Hillman, and it just built from there. All of these depth psychological thinkers and adjacent thinkers and makers, of course, creators, of course. I began to find such deep wisdom in their insights that I started to collect, to make a serious effort of documenting and collecting those things that were meaningful to me, that I felt that other artists and creators of all types really needed to experience, to know. So it's been a decades-long process. The actual writing of the book was maybe a 3-4 year process, including over the COVID years. You hear stories of creative people who use that time to just like dive into big projects and get those things done. And that was really not the case with me. It was a difficult, but also deeply rewarding process of writing this book.
Why was it difficult, Mary? I'm just, if I could preface that a little, sometimes I think it's maybe like having a baby, and some babies just come out quick, don't they? And then some are a bit of a struggle, but it doesn't mean the ones that are a struggle are any less because of that struggle. Sometimes they might even be a little more.
Yeah, I think the struggle came from the balance of those things that you alluded to earlier, and that I really, really wanted to get the scholarship right. I wanted to go back to original sources. I wanted to check everything out in context to make sure that what I was proposing or what I was suggesting that others had proposed, for example, Jung or Hillman or Neumann or Anais Nin or any of the other myriad of fantastic voices that I incorporated, that I really got that right, and that I understood what they were talking about to the best of my ability. And as you mentioned, I did not want to reduce the mystery. I wanted to keep the ideas around the creativity, an artist's calling, the nature of the soul, as open as possible.
Yeah, which is a fine balancing act, isn't it? I mean, it is, to keep them both together.
Yes, to keep them together without spinning off into sort of gauzy, conjecture, with allowing yourself to set down some points, to make some arguments, to back them up as well as you can, but also to leave room for others to imagine and continue to imagine into these ideas.
Mary, one thing I've noticed is just, let's say with my Facebook friends, that there's a lot of creativity emerging in this time. That, I have a friend who's all of a sudden started portrait painting out of nowhere, didn't even know about that maybe 6 months ago or whatever. And so many people are having the call to create, as you say, and it's emerging in so many people. And I was thinking about it this morning. It's a little bit like, think of Joseph Campbell, that you go into the forest and you kind of start hacking your own path, but you don't quite, there's this huge, call, but you can't really follow someone else's path with creativity, so you're trying to find a path. And then what I liked about what you've written is how you kind of linked back to, because creativity is a relatively new word, isn't it? I mean, you know, back some time, you know, William Shakespeare didn't think of himself as a creative or a cultural creative or something, you know, but it's linked to the past and maybe some of the artists or the poets or the philosophers or the shamans, or so there's a kind of a tradition. That's what I like about what you've done. It's like it's to go back into some tradition of so many different kinds of people and what they were doing and how you can link that to your own process. That's really valuable.
Yes, I think it's extremely valuable to see yourself mirrored in not only creators of the present and the past, the historic past, but also in mythic figures. So there is a chapter on the various styles of making, of poesis, as seen through mythic figures from a number of cultures, particularly the Greek gods and goddesses associated with making in such different styles. And you touch upon the shamanic origins, which there's an idea of a shamanic sensibility that runs through the book. It was not at the forefront when I first began conceptualizing this project, and even when I began writing it, but it just kept coming up. So I flowed with that. I was actually a little bit worried about it, that it would
overtake
perhaps
the book.
Perhaps come off as being less scholarly or a little too leaning toward the esoteric. But the more I researched, the more I learned as I was doing this project, that sensibility, and I like to use that term because the shaman and shamanism is a living tradition still today. So I want to keep that separate from the contemporary artist and maker. But what is not separate are those early, very early roots of poesis, of making, as a way to not only heal, but to come into contact with other kinds of realities beyond that which we see. It's the idea of the artist creator is a kind of, and shaman, healer, medicine person, as this sort of psychopomp, this bridge, this guide between worlds, the traveler between worlds, is very it's very striking, and I think it's going to be very inspiring and ennobling for today's creators to imagine into that.
Yes, because sometimes it's like, I don't know, there's that just the shorthand version, or you know, the short version as I see it is sometimes that the person who has a little of that in them, you know, in the shaman or whatever, is called in, it has some kind of creative illness, or is called into something which makes them go deeper, and perhaps starts off that there might even be a reluctance in the beginning, you know.
Absolutely. Yeah, I see that all the time with my graduate students, with my clients in my personal practice. The reluctance, the suffering that comes with that, with turning yourself over to living a life that requires that kind of participation, that kind of devotion, really. And the creative illness is such a fantastic idea, you know, originated in Ellenberger's book, Henri Ellenberger, about the origins of dynamic psychiatry, I believe, if I'm getting the title right,
Yeah.
Which takes us back to those early days of depth psychology with Freud and Jung, and even precursors. And Ellenberger makes those wonderful links about creative illness, and shows that a rupture of some kind, a serious loss, an illness, an accident, something that is profound enough to shake us out of habitual ways of life.
Yeah.
Or set a path for us. Perhaps it happens as a young person, and that path is set quite early. But I think for a lot of us, that time of creative illness does not happen until later in life. You know, we can look at Jung and his creative illness. He was in his 30s at that point, where he was going through that multi-year period of deep questioning, suffering, and finally emerged from that with, even in his own words, his life's work was there that emerged from that deep descent.
Yeah. And I remember Jung saying that a lot of his clients, just taking it from a slightly different angle, didn't have any clinically, I'm just talking about different approaches to psychology. Like, many of his clients didn't have a clinically definable condition. They just needed assistance in fulfilling their creative potential. And to me, that is such an important point, because it's like, you know, we know about the branch of psychology which is strongly oriented towards diagnosis or whatever, but it's like that, you know, it seems to me Jung was saying there's an instinct, a creative instinct, and that also needs to be satisfied, as other instincts need to be satisfied. It's kind of, and that there's some thing about creativity that we need to satisfy within us. And in a way, that work is like a cure as well.
Yes, I would agree. He was explicit about that. And that's one of the passages from a lecture that he did, I think, in the 20s on instincts, human instincts. I do quote that in my chapter on Jung, because it's so important for us to consider as contemporary people that, along with, he lists 5, I believe: hunger, sexuality, an instinct toward interiority or reflection, an instinct toward action in the world, exteriority, and then a creative instinct, this psychic creativity, that potential is akin to an instinct. So that is our birthright as human beings. It's there, it wants expression. So that is one very key point, especially around the question of this idea of creativity only belonging to certain people. And so many people suffering from ideas or things that they've been told and internalized, that thinking that they're not creative. You know, I can't do that. It won't look good, or it won't sound good, or I could never do that. And yet,
or creativity is the preserve of just a few geniuses, you know, the Michelangelos of the world, or whatever, and that it would be presumptuous of us to think that we could also be creative, which is so far. Like, if creativity is an instinct, then it is for all, you know, regardless of the kind of artistic talent. Even it's more about that instinct is something we all have.
Yes, and our according to Jung and also to James Hillman, our greatest creative accomplishment, our opus, is our own lives. So the value of creativity goes, and living a creative life, recognizing and honoring, nurturing that creative instinct, goes far beyond the making of things and experiences. Although that has a very important place for us as human beings as well.
So we're also making our own soul.
Yes, it's Hillman's soul making notion, which he went so far as to compare to the actual crafting of things, that when we work with images, whether that's dream work or other types of imaginal sorts of making, we're crafting a soul, much like an artist or an artisan craftsperson works with materials, that the soul requires, longs for a variety of experiences. It wants to, it seemingly wants to add new facets of itself all the time, to be fashioned and refashioned, and we are partners in that.
Can you explain that a little more, Mary? What do you mean it wants new things? Is this kind of the novel? Are you talking about the pure side of the, you know, where we want newness, or are you talking about something else?
Yeah, I'm not so much talking about novelty. I think one of the things that I've been rolling around in my mind for some time, and it's come up recently with one of my clients, a young woman who lives in France, is how to, and she has a good sense of both James Hillman and Jung's work. And we were talking about this idea of multiplicity that is so prominent in Hillman's work, not so much in Jung's, his wholeness in Jung, but the multiplicity in Hillman. And if we have, as Hillman said, all of these various figures, these mythic themes, storylines that want to be expressed through us, with us,
I get it.
Then how do we reconcile that with the idea, Hillman's idea of the acorn, his acorn theory, that the innate image is there from the beginning, and that it works. It's that third thing between nature and nurture. It's a third way to imagine how a human life unfolds. But in that notion, in that model, there is a kind of desiring entity that has some intentions coming into the world, a sort of singular entity. If we think of the soul with its companion daemon that helps keep it on track, that continues to give it reminders of its destiny.
I would see what you're talking about, sorry, I'm butting in there. One thing I would see, there's kind of like this, you know, in Joseph Campbell again, right? You wander out of the village, you go into the forest, you go into a cave, and if you're lucky, if the monster doesn't kill you and you get a bit of treasure, you bring something back. So you might think, what is it that, you know, and he said the return is sometimes harder than going on the adventure in the first place. Like you come back to your community and you bring, so you might think about that specifically, like what is it that one has to bring or whatever. But then I also get what you're talking about in the multiplicity. It's like, which is polytheistic James Hillman, isn't it? It's that there's this kind of Hermes side that likes play and a bit of, you know, what is it? A certain style of creativity, you know, the mercurial and the quicksilver and all of that. And then there's another style of, you know, Apollo might like something a little bit different, or Aphrodite, Venus might like something a little bit different. You know, she might like the actual beauty of the thing, so it's kind of like maybe we have different sides with all these, you know, imaginations.
Yes, yeah, I think we are more multiple then we know. I really am very drawn to this idea of the multiple self, of having many characters within, if we want to personify and imagine characters, but also longings for experience. So it's back to, what does the soul want? What is the image, the daemon, the angel, all of those words that Hillman would use so interchangeably to kind of keep us off balance, so that we don't get so inflated that we think we know what the soul is and what it wants. But the more I think about multiplicity versus a singular soul with intentions, I imagine the soul as a multiplicity itself, as a they more than a he or she or it.
So tell me how it works for you, Hermes. Let's do a little word association for a while. Hermes, how does it operate? How has it operated in your creativity and your creative expression?
Hermes has been hugely influential. Thinking of the idea of the emissary, the messenger, the psychopomp, the risk taker, this entity that can, this energy that can link worlds, that is a good translator, that is a mediator. I really like that idea of mediation, which is also, just jumping back to the soul for a moment, one of the best ideas I think that Hillman can offer us for what the soul is, does, where it is. So yes, Hermes very, very prominent for me in thinking about not only myself, but all creative people and healers as well. You know, Hermes unites that healer with the creator in this journeying between worlds.
Yeah, in between, or journeying in between two worlds or whatever. Yeah.
And
so
in the message,
Aphrodite, Venus, how does that come through in your creative expression? I can see it a lot in your visual art that I've seen, you know, through your book and, you know.
Yeah, I think the Aphrodite Venus figure is not a figure that I think about explicitly very often when I think of myself. I think there's that the sense of pleasure in making things, in working with materials and textures, and crafting a, you know, maybe a beautiful sentence. But yeah, she is not as prominent as maybe some other figures.
I don't know, because I think you might have succeeded in your book in the sense of having Aphrodite Venus in your book. Like, it could have been a good scholarly book, but you've kind of got that little bit of Aphrodite Venus in there, which is good, you know.
Yeah, I wanted to have a sort of you know, poetic sensibility, a sense of beauty running through the piece, as well as the solidity, you know, the Senex solidity of the discipline.
The scholar.
Yeah, the scholar. But I see that the scholar more in tandem and in play with Hermes, like the puer-senex relationship.
Right.
More so than the Venus Aphrodite.
And out of the other cast of characters in the pantheon, is there any others you can think of that kind of call?
I think the Dionysian is important for risking oneself, for allowing that sort of the falling apart, and putting oneself back together again. The communal spirit of Dionysus is important in what not only, well, I think less so in what happened in this particular book, but more so in my life working with other creative people.
The communal aspect of making
The
together.
communal, yes, aspect of deeply enriching discussions and vulnerable conversations and performance, ritual, all of the things that can come into a setting that is academic, but that's also very transformative. So I feel that Dionysian ecstatic excitement quite often, but especially when I'm with those fellow creators and scholars.
I think, there's this thing of when one starts off in creativity a little, there's this thought, oh, wow, great, now I'll get into creativity. That'll be great. That'll be fun. And then maybe somewhere along the track you go, hey, hang on. There's other things in operation here. And like, I remember having a dream once when we're writing, and there was a woman behind me, and she was like a giant. When I looked behind, she was like huge and like a giant, and she had her hand on. And I can remember waking up and being freaked out, because it's like some archetypal, you've touched upon something big or something. And so it's like, there's this naivety towards creativity. You think, oh, this will be fun. I'm going to get in there, do this and that. And then, there's forces of, they're strong forces maybe, aren't they? And then B, there's that kind of how you have to break down. Like, it's not just the will. Like, maybe out there in the normal world, there's this thing of, oh, well, you have an aim and you have an object and you just, bang, go and create something. But it's like you have to keep on breaking down and building up and breaking down and building up. I mean, it's not for the faint-hearted in one way.
No, it is not at all. And that is, part of that Dionysian energy again. And I am also reminded, when you are describing that dream and this larger force, of the poet Stanley Kunitz, who was, but his words still live. He's no longer living. Such an amazing what's the word I'm looking for? Not so much a translator, but kind of a seer into the true nature of the creative. This force, he would call it like a visitation from the dark angel, that something other than human, some awe-inspiring energy, a cloud, he would describe it as a cloud sometimes, would approach him, and it would be as amazing and ecstatic as it would be terrifying for him. And he knew that he would need to submit himself to that greater power. And Jung talks about the artist, the creative person, as submitting to a quote unquote alien will. In one of those wonderful essays in The Spirit and Man, Art, and Literature, his collected works, volume 15, those two great iconic essays. So that idea of surrender and submission, and the rather terrifying prospect of a non-human eternal force that's wanting to come into relationship with you. Like you say, it's not for the faint of heart. And to say yes to that is a commitment.
It's like when Jung talks about the numinous, you know, there's that awe and a little bit of, what's the word, trembling, because it's big. Mm-hmm. Like we think the numinous is a good, you know, a great thing, but it's also got that little bit of trembling and maybe creativity in that way. It's kind of like a numinosum or something, or however you say that word, I don't know.
Yeah, it's coming into relationship with what you're getting at, what Campbell called the mysterium tremendum et fascinas. You know, it's that great mystery that is that arrests us. One of his great phrases talking about what moves us is aesthetic arrest, that we can be just stopped in our tracks and arrested by the magnificence and overpowering nature of the numinous, of the divine, of the great mystery that we're all a part of.
And again, I think that's what, you know, maybe that's what I've taken from reading you. It's like to broaden and deepen the creative. Like there's an idea of creative, isn't there? And then it's like, really, it's so linked to depth psychology or the depth dimension of the psyche or the collective. You know, you can't really talk about creativity without talking about the soul and these dimensions, can you?
No, I don't think you can. You can do it, but in a superficial way. But to go much deeper, you do have to address ideas of the soul, multicultural ideas. You have to talk about the ideas of other dimensions, about a spirit world, or the great mystery, or energies that are not visible to our human eyes, our everyday eyes anyway. As I'm saying that, I'm thinking of Henri Corbin, one of James Hillman's chief influences, the French scholar and mystic, scholar of Islamic mysticism.
Yeah.
He wrote about the difference between what he called eyes of flesh, eyes that see the world as more or less dead, static material objects, this sort of Cartesian split of, you know, I live, everything out there is just sort of stuff, dead stuff, those eyes of flesh, versus eyes of fire. And eyes of fire are like the eyes of a mystic, of a seer, that can penetrate through that and see the ensouled world, the anima mundi, the life, this interconnected matrix of energies that, of course, we are a part of. We're not just a neutral observer. So these two kinds of vision, the eyes of flesh and the eyes of fire, can combine in a creative person, where you can sort of move back and forth as if you're, you know, dreaming with eyes open. That's a beautiful way to describe both the shamanic experience and an art making experience, creative expression.
And what is the anima mundi?
The anima mundi is the ensouled world. It is the world.
Hillman was very big on the anima mundi, wasn't he?
Oh, yes, yes.
Well, Jung too, but Hillman in his own way.
Yeah, Hillman especially is in those beautiful short lectures of his are the two that I like to start people with who have not read any Hillman. You know, don't start with Revisioning Psychology, or you may run for the exit, but or maybe not, depending. But do start with Thought of the Soul, Thought of the Heart and Soul of the World. So where he lays out those ideas about a living, ensouled cosmos, which of course is not that far from, you know, what we might call indigenous ideas about the world.
Just about what I was about to say is that there's that, and it seems to me that we've lost so much in the modern secular world by losing that, haven't we? We've lost so much connection, so much relationship to things.
It's probably our greatest loss. It's probably the root loss that has led us to where we are now with the climate crisis, with the way we treat animals, the way we treat each other, the way we can dehumanize each other because we de-soul the world around us so easily.
One thing I get from Hillman is, you know, we often think in political solutions or whatever, and when he's talking about the anima mundi and that beauty, it's that and myth, it kind of reorients us to the right relationship to things. And it seems to me it's kind of like that, and that's where art can actually bring change by that. By that change of consciousness.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more that, you know, art has, and art making, art products, art experiences, anything we would group under those terms, has real power. You might call it magic if, you know, it wouldn't take us into like an esoteric sort of woo-woo sort of area. But you can make very convincing arguments that the arts and artists can just bypass the rational mind, bypass a lot of what keeps us numb, keeps us anesthetized, and go directly to the heart, to the soul. One of the most wonderful passages that I recall on that theme is D.H. Lawrence, who wrote that art has a moral imperative, that it's not didactic, it's not pastime, it's something that, again, bypasses rationality, the intellect, and can change the blood. I love how he says that. It changes the blood first. It's visceral. And then, only then, does it change the mind in its wake. So these kind of powers are real if we take ourselves seriously as creators.
Yeah. So what do you find when the people come along to your, you know, when you're holding programs, your Dionysian programs? What do you find with people? What's happening with people? And what are they looking for? And you know what I mean? Like,
yeah, I think if there's a common thread, it's a longing to fulfill a potential. So maybe it's that daimonic urge, and that can happen at any age. But particularly, I think between about 30 and 50, you know, that kind of classic Jungian midlife period. So it's multi-leveled, but certainly a personal fulfillment of, this is my time. If I don't do this now, it's not going to happen. I will have to shut down this part of myself and conform, or I've been conforming or pleasing others, or, you know, simply providing for myself and my family. And, you know, I've had one kind of life, but something else is that daimonic nudging, you know, is not going away. So I do see that, but I also see it not only for that urging is not only for personal deepening or enhancement or growth, enlargement. It is for service.
Yeah.
They're questioning, what is the very best way that I can serve now? And if I don't see myself as a traditional therapist, which the institute where I teach has wonderful programs for people looking, who know that that is their realm where they can serve. But the creative folks that come into my program are looking to serve in other ways. They're wondering how their films, their novels, their performances, their retreats that they build for people, their teaching, their healing practices, how can those be infused with new understandings, new energy, a new set of peers and supporters and mentors to translate into offerings that are going to do just what I said, referring to Lawrence a moment ago. How can we dare to dream, and how can we find the applicable tools to move our work out into the world in ways that are going to change the blood. They're going to change people at a level that causes real change in the world.
So the artist as instrument, in a way, too, as instrument, or as an instrument of service in the world.
Yes, an instrument, medium, channel, facilitator. I like the instrument idea. That has just a really nice feel to it.
Yeah, that's good. And just going back to yourself there for a second, Mary, but you must have got the creative nudgings when you were very young, if you went into that field, if you went and worked in that area. So you kind of, if you had a few sets of nudgings along the way.
I've had a few sets, and my own experiences, looking back on my own life, the longer we're around, the more we can look back on. I see it definitely a multiplicity with different characters taking the lead at different times. And some of that influenced by the people around me, especially, and that happens with all of us, especially when we're children. Right. In our families, friends, immediate surroundings, you kind of get labeled as the creative one, the smart one, the athletic one, the rebel, all these kind of archetypal patterns that may last through your life, and they may only last through childhood. But I was the quote unquote smart one in the family. So I had that ease with the academics in my early years of school. But I also see the psychopomp, the Hermes, showing up when I think back to, let's say my high school years, where, high school in America is so archetypal with all of these different sorts of mythic figures playing themselves out in different groups. But I had friends in every group, friends with the smart people, the valedictorians, the athletic people, the homecoming queen, the Aphrodite was a wonderful friend. And I was this Hermes, very comfortable in all these different groups. But still the smart one in my family unit. Once I went into college, I stumbled into an art class as an elective. And I was thinking seriously it would be like a writer or who knows what, but something kind of serious and smart, because I was the smart one. But I stumbled into this class and just fell in love with it and dropped all. ideas of anything else I wanted to do. So then this devotion to art and art making only occurred to me, in my 20s. It wasn't, perhaps it was latent, it was there, it wasn't fanned, the little flame was not fanned or encouraged.
Did it shock everyone when this happened? When you?
It did, yeah, and I think it still reverberates in the family, as things can in families, because my sister was the creative one. So once I sort of merged the creative with the scholarly and became this hybrid, it was a little disorienting.
You broke type, in other words.
Yes, it broke type. So another facet became known, and I merged a couple, and this hybrid person, I think, is the person that is still here today with different opportunities that I've had. So there were decades.
Who holds sway now, would you say? The scholar or the creative? Or do they get on well, or do they have their arguments, or what happened?
All of the above. Yeah, they get on well. The scholar has been holding sway, I think, for a little too long now. I think she needs to kind of not exit, but maybe move to stage left for a moment or two, and let the creator, the person who doesn't want to talk in words so much, doesn't want to use language, perhaps the creator who wants to go back to materials, to working with my hands, with images.
Right.
So yeah, words have been very prominent.
Well, particularly writing a book. I
Yes.
remember reading a story about Rumi that, well, firstly, he was a scholar. He was a scholar, right? For a good, strong scholar in his, what was it, Sufi religion or whatever. And then he had to throw out the books, and then he's got that poem of you have to go outside, and there's that kind of, what is it? It's that, there's that leap, isn't there? Like he changed somewhere from a scholar to a poet, and his poem was, you have to go outside. It's a scary leap, isn't it? Too. Well, I mean, with all of us every day.
Yeah, it really is. I was thinking just before we started talking, it flashed into my mind, and I can't even remember the exact book it's in, but, James Hollis, the American contemporary Jungian, who's so well known and such a wonderful speaker and writer. In one of his books, he says that every morning we wake up with two gremlins at the end of the bed. And one is lethargy and one is fear.
Wow.
So these are, forces that all of us, no matter what we do, but I think especially with people who do creative work, who have a devotion, a calling to creative work, you have to tangle with those two frequently, if not every day.
Yeah. Well, Mary, we're getting close to things, but I'd like to ask you a couple of quick final things, if I may.
Yeah.
The cover of your book with the kind of Medusa snake hair, can you tell us about that for a second?
Yes, it is a mixed media collage painting that I created called The Sorceress. And I knew that I wanted to have one of my own images on this book. And thankfully, the editors at Routledge were very welcoming to that. And I had several that were possibilities. But in the end, this one really seemed to express the idea of just the wonder and the danger of being a creative person, of wielding a kind of power that is that can be scary, that can be overwhelming, but that is also something like nature itself. You know, when you have this idea of the serpent. So this figure here is not only having the serpent emerge out of her head, out of her body, she's in this a very calm pose, very calm expression.
Yeah.
The collage image that I used, and she is also
wild at the same time.
Working with the serpent with her hands. There's one entwined around her arm with great calm. So it points to the sort of the strength, the ability of the sorcerer, the wizard, the magician, the shaman, the healer, and of course the connection to Hermes with the caduceus, the serpents on his staff, is not lost here. And the connection to Asclepius with the single serpent on his staff, the healer, is not lost. So it sort of brings this together in a female figure, of one who wields a mysterious healing power.
Yeah. And it's got I think it's a little like your book, maybe. It's got both, it's kind of got the classic and that kind of archaic happening at the same time.
Yeah, I think it really does. And that's why it works well as the cover image, because there's as much in this book that is ancient as there is that is contemporary. And I try to bring them together and show how well some of these very, very old ideas still work for us today.
Well, that's great. And I don't know whether we should get onto this, but you were talking about Gloria and
Yes.
Do you want to say just a little bit about her? Because I had a little read of her book, and I think someone who's what I liked from the little I read was, I think someone that's, well, firstly, I got from Gloria, she's got that intellectual side, but because of the way she uses language and brings in the Spanish, it's a little bit similar to what we were just talking about. It brings in that whole other. And, Clarissa Pinkola Estes, it reminded me a little of the way she brings in the Spanish to some of her writing. But do you want to say something a little bit about Gloria? Because
I would love to. I would love to. And I'm so glad you brought her in and that you took the time to investigate some of her work. But Gloria Anzaldúa is one of my primary influences in my work. For one, starting with the fact that we both have a lot in common in the way we grew up. She grew up on the Texas-Mexico border. I grew up on the Arizona Mexico border. Her family were of Mexican and indigenous origins. They were farm workers in that area. And she was not expected to be a scholar, to go much further than the expectations of women at that time in the 50s and 60s in that area. Somewhat similar to my story as well. I grew up with a single mom. My father died when I was quite young. He was American. My mother's Mexican. She's still living, but she was a single mom of two girls and was not an American citizen until I was in high school. So we had a kind of precarious lifestyle, much like Gloria did. And I grew up going back and forth across the border in a town that abuts the border fence, the two towns that come together, as many of them do, with my mother's family on the Mexican side and the three of us on the other side, on the US side. So her, not only this biography, but her theories that came from that, these ideas of the borderlands, of being, again, I think we're back to a Hermes kind of psychopomp. She has this idea, the theory she calls Nepantla, this place of kind of chaotic place without a real ground to stand on, where two worlds abut. So she and I both grew up literally where two worlds come together. So she's important to me and inspiring in that way. I love her risking the personal. That was one of her chief aims of getting in there to academia and kind of shaking it up, and not being afraid to bring in personal story, which she called autohistoria, personal narrative. She brought in her spirituality, her sexuality, her gender, and her love of a myth of Mexico and Mesoamerica, which is something that was another link as well, because so much of my visual art for decades has turned to those same myths for inspiration, those figures and stories. But I'll finish with just saying what I see as being so exciting about her now, even though she's been gone for 14 or 15 years, is that she read Jung, she read Hillman, she read widely from depth psychology and depth psychologically adjacent philosophers, thinkers, scholars, makers. And then she was able to sort of synthesize this into a way of looking at these same ideas that is so inclusive and so beautiful.
There's something conjunctive about it, conjunctio of the, it all comes together in the same paragraph. The intellect, the learning, and the old, again, it's all coming together.
And I think for people with interest in Jung and Hillman, who have a little bit of a foothold in things like the ideas of archetypes or the daemon, you're going to find that in her, but coming from a different culture. The daemon is a more or less a correlate to the Nawal or the Nawala, this sort of spirit guide that can be an animal or it can be a person that shifts into different forms. The shape-shifting idea is wonderful to look at with this idea of that guiding force of the daemon.
I think with some writers, like Hillman, to me, his daemon really comes out, his peculiarity. And I suppose, I know there are people that don't like it, don't respond to it or whatever, but I often think it's like when the daemon comes out in someone, like if you're part of their larger soul clan or something like that, it's kind of like what you like to read.
Yeah, we're just drawn to things like that. There was a passage in I think lament of that was Hillman and Sonu Shamdasani, and says that the ideas that call to us are meant for us, that there are certain themes and ideas, people that we absolutely resonate with.
Clan. I think that invisible community I think of sometimes too, because even the people that died a long time ago, like Heraclitus or whatever, that they're part of some extended clan or whatever.
Absolutely, yeah. Hillman talked about the philosophical family tree. That's actually an exercise that I've done with people in workshop settings and in class, where we construct, who are your philosophical elders? Where do your ideas come from? Who do you gravitate toward? It doesn't have to be philosophers per se, but Gloria and Hillman and Jung, they'd be like these wonderful birds on my tree. Certainly.
Well, thanks very much, Mary. And I've enjoyed your book a lot. I've highlighted far too much of it, but I got a lot of important things, and especially things to go back to and have a look at again. And I've really enjoyed it. And thanks for sharing so generously.
Oh, it's been a wonderful pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.